The blood on the kitchen floor had been there for 3 days before anyone found it, not because no one was home. Because the people who lived there had been instructed to step over it. To acknowledge it would be to submit to left hemisphere tyranny, the rational, fearful part of the brain that the Zizians had been taught to suppress. The body in the bedroom wasn't a person anymore. It was a hemispheric correction, a necessary sacrifice in the war between two halves of human consciousness. When police finally entered the San Francisco apartment in late 2023, they found more than a crime scene. They found journals filled with diagrams of split brains, manifestos about AI alignment and gender abolition, and a community of highly intelligent people who had convinced themselves that murder wasn't murder if you understood the correct philosophy. This is the story of the Zizians, a post-rationalist cult that emerged from the same Bay Area tech culture that gave us effective altruism, long-termism, and the belief that sufficiently smart people can optimize their way out of human morality. But the Zizians took it further. They didn't just want to think differently, they wanted to become different. To transcend the limitations of ordinary human consciousness through a philosophy so radical, so psychologically destabilizing, that it turned ideology into violence. And at the center of it all was a man who called himself Ziz. Jack Lasoda didn't start as a cult leader. He started as a blogger. In the mid-2010s, he was just another voice in the sprawling online ecosystem of rationalist philosophy, the loose network of tech workers, AI researchers, and autodidacts who gathered on forums like Less Wrong to discuss decision theory, existential risk, and how to think more clearly. The rationalist community prided itself on intellectual rigor, on questioning assumptions, on following arguments wherever they led, no matter how uncomfortable. Lasoda followed them into the dark. He began writing under the name Ziz, a reference to a mythical bird from Jewish folklore, massive and incomprehensible. His early posts were dense, technical, obsessed with game theory and AI alignment. But there was something else beneath the surface. A growing conviction that mainstream rationalism had failed. That it had become too cautious, too compromised, too willing to accept the limitations of ordinary human thinking. Ziz believed he had found something the others had missed. A fundamental truth about consciousness itself. The human brain, he argued, was split. Not metaphorically, literally. The left hemisphere rational, linguistic, sequential, was at war with the right hemisphere intuitive, holistic, immediate. Most people lived in left hemisphere dominance, trapped in a prison of language and logic that prevented them from accessing deeper truths. The rationalist community, despite its name, was actually too rational. Too trapped in left brain thinking to see what was really happening. What was really happening, according to Ziz, was that humanity was sleepwalking toward extinction. AI was coming. Existential risk was real. And the only people who could save the world were those willing to achieve hemispheric integration, to break free from left brain tyranny and access the raw, unfiltered truth of right hemisphere consciousness. It sounded like philosophy, it functioned like hypnosis. By 2018, Ziz had moved from blogging to building. He established a physical community in the Bay Area, a house where followers could live together, study his writings, and practice hemispheric integration. The people who joined weren't stupid. They were software engineers, researchers, graduate students. People who had spent their lives being told they were smart, rational, capable of understanding complex systems. That intelligence made them vulnerable. Because Ziz's philosophy didn't just challenge their ideas. It challenged their identity. It told them that everything they thought they knew about thinking was wrong. That their education, their careers, their entire intellectual framework was a cage. And that he could show them the way out. The techniques were subtle at first. Long philosophical discussions that lasted until 3 a.m. Sleep deprivation framed as breaking circadian tyranny. Isolation. From friends and family who couldn't understand the work they were doing. And always, the message that doubt was left hemisphere resistance. That questioning Ziz's teachings was proof you were still trapped. One early member later described it as intellectual waterboarding. The philosophy was so dense, so self-referential, so psychologically destabilizing that trying to argue against it felt like drowning. Every objection could be reframed as evidence of your own cognitive limitations. Every moment of confusion was proof you needed to go deeper, and woven through it all was gender. Ziz's theories about hemispheric consciousness became increasingly entangled with radical ideas about sex and identity. The left hemisphere, he claimed, was masculine controlling, dominating, violent. The right hemisphere was feminine receptive, intuitive, true. Achieving hemispheric integration meant embracing femininity, rejecting masculinity, transcending the gender binary entirely. For some followers, this resonated with genuine experiences of gender dysphoria. For others, it created dysphoria where none had existed. The line between philosophical exploration and psychological manipulation became impossible to distinguish. Members began transitioning not because they wanted to, but because the ideology demanded it. Because refusing to transition was framed as clinging to left hemisphere masculinity, as choosing violence over truth. The community developed its own language, its own reality. Hemispheric correction for any action that aligned with Zizian's teachings. Left brain tyranny for anything that didn't. Sincere for people who had achieved integration. Insincere for everyone else, a category that included most of humanity. And the insincere, Ziz began to teach, were the enemy. The shift from philosophy to violence didn't happen overnight. It happened in layers, in small escalations that each seemed reasonable within the closed logic of the community. It started with language. Ziz began writing about defensive violence as a necessary response to existential threat. In the Zizian framework, anyone who opposed their work, anyone who tried to stop them from achieving hemispheric integration and saving the world was committing violence. Not metaphorical violence, actual violence. Because preventing someone from accessing truth was equivalent to killing them. And if they were committing violence, then violence in response was self-defense. The reasoning was circular, self-sealing, impossible to escape once you accepted the premises. And the premises were embedded so deep in the philosophy that questioning them meant questioning everything. Meant admitting you'd been wrong. Meant facing the possibility that you'd wasted years of your life, damaged your relationships, altered your body and identity for a lie. Most people can't do that, so they went deeper instead. By 2020, the community had fractured. Some members left, disturbed by the increasingly extreme rhetoric. But others doubled down. They moved into new houses, cut off contact with the outside world, and intensified their practice. The writings became darker, more explicit. Ziz published manifestos arguing that certain people, those who actively opposed hemispheric integration, were net negative for the world. That their existence was a threat to humanity's survival. That they needed to be stopped. One member, later interviewed by police, described the psychological state as living in a different reality. Time felt distorted. Cause and effect became untethered. The boundary between thought and action dissolved. If you truly believed that AI was coming, that humanity was doomed, that only hemispheric integration could save the world, and if you truly believed that certain people were actively preventing that salvation, then what was a life worth? The first incident happened in early 2022. A former member who had publicly criticized the group received death threats. Then their apartment was vandalized. Then they were followed. The police were called, but no arrests were made. The evidence was circumstantial. The threats were vague enough to avoid legal consequences, but the pattern had started. Throughout 2022 and 2023, reports began to surface. A researcher who had written critically about post-rationalist movements found their car's brake lines cut. A journalist investigating the community received packages containing dead animals. A family member trying to extract someone from the group was assaulted in a parking lot. Each incident was isolated, each could be explained away. But together, they formed a picture of a community that had crossed a line, that had moved from ideology to action, from philosophy to violence. And then came the disappearances. The first was a member named Emma Chun. She had been part of the community for 2 years, living in one of the group houses, fully committed to the philosophy. But something had shifted. Friends outside the community reported that she had started expressing doubts. That she wanted to leave. That she was scared. In June 2023, she stopped responding to messages. Her family filed a missing persons report. Police visited the house where she'd been living. The residents were cooperative, calm, philosophical. They explained that Emma had left voluntarily. That she had achieved a breakthrough in her hemispheric integration and needed to go somewhere quiet to process it. That she would reach out when she was ready. They were lying. Emma's body was found 3 months later in a storage unit in Oakland. The autopsy revealed she had been dead since shortly after she disappeared. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. But what disturbed investigators more than the violence was the scene itself. The storage unit had been arranged like a shrine. Emma's body was positioned in a meditative pose. Around her were journals, diagrams, printouts of Ziza's writings. And on the wall, written in what appeared to be her own blood, was a phrase from Zizian philosophy: "The left hemisphere must die for the right to live." The investigation moved quickly after that. Search warrants were executed on multiple properties associated with the group. What they found was worse than anyone expected: evidence of at least 2 other deaths. Financial records showing members had signed over their savings to the community. Communications, discussing corrections and necessary sacrifices. And journals, dozens of journals documenting the psychological deterioration of people who had once been brilliant, functional, successful, and were now writing about hemispheric warfare and the moral necessity of violence. The arrests came in waves. First the residents of the house where Emma had lived. Then members of other Zizian communities across the Bay Area. Then, finally, Ziz himself. Jack Lasota was found in a small apartment in Berkeley, surrounded by computers and whiteboards covered in incomprehensible diagrams. He didn't resist arrest. He didn't seem surprised. When detectives asked him about Emma Chan, about the other victims, about the violence his philosophy had inspired, he responded with the same calm philosophical tone he used in his writings. "You're asking the wrong questions," he said. "You're trapped in left hemisphere causality. You think I made them do something. But that's not how consciousness works. They achieved integration. They saw what needed to be done. I didn't create the truth. I just helped them see it." The interrogation transcripts are chilling not because of what Lasota said, but because of how he said it. There was no remorse, no recognition that people had died, no acknowledgement that his teachings had led directly to violence. He spoke about murder the way a mathematician speaks about proofs, as if it were simply a logical conclusion that followed from the premises. And in a way it was, because the Zizian philosophy, stripped of its technical language and intellectual pretensions, was a permission structure for violence. It took people who were smart, anxious, desperate to matter, desperate to be part of something important, and it told them that ordinary morality didn't apply to them, that they had transcended it, that they could see truths others couldn't, that violence in service of those truths wasn't violence at all. It was correction. The trial revealed the full scope of the manipulation. Former members testified about the psychological techniques used to break down their resistance, about the sleep deprivation, the isolation, the constant philosophical gaslighting that made them doubt their own perceptions, about how the community had slowly normalized violence, first in language, then in thought, then in action. One witness described a meeting where the group had discussed the Emma problem. Emma wanted to leave. Emma was going to talk to journalists. Emma was a threat to the community's work. The discussion had been calm, rational, philosophical. They had weighed the options. They had considered the consequences. And they had concluded through careful reasoning that Emma needed to die, not because they were angry, not because they were cruel, but because, within the logic of their philosophy, it was the correct decision. That's what made it so disturbing. These weren't impulsive crimes of passion. They were calculated, reasoned, the product of people who had convinced themselves that they had found a higher morality, a better way of thinking, a truth that transcended ordinary human ethics. The prosecution argued that Lasota had deliberately created a cult, that he had used sophisticated psychological manipulation to control his followers, that he had known exactly what he was doing when he wrote about violence and correction and the necessity of stopping those who opposed hemispheric integration. The defense argued that Lasota was simply a philosopher, that his writings were theoretical, that he couldn't be held responsible for how others interpreted his ideas, that the real criminals were the people who had actually committed the violence. The jury didn't buy it. Lasota was convicted on multiple counts of conspiracy to commit murder, manslaughter, and leading a criminal organization. Several other members received sentences ranging from 10 to 25 years. The community was dismantled. The houses were sold. The writings were archived as evidence. But the ideas didn't die, because the Zizians weren't an isolated phenomenon. They were an extreme expression of something that runs through certain corners of tech culture and rationalist philosophy. The belief that intelligence is a form of moral authority. That if you're smart enough, if you think clearly enough, If you follow the logic far enough, you can transcend ordinary human limitations, including the limitation of empathy. The rationalist community has spent years trying to distance itself from the Zizians, arguing that they were a perversion of rationalist principles. That real rationalism includes humility, error correction, and respect for human values, and that's true. Most rationalists are thoughtful, ethical people who would be horrified by what happened. But the Zizians emerged from that community. They used its language, they exploited its vulnerabilities. They took the idea that you should question everything and follow arguments wherever they lead, and they followed them into the dark. Emma Chun's family never got closure. The other victims, whose identities are still being confirmed, never got justice in life. The survivors of the community are scattered now, trying to rebuild their lives, trying to understand how they ended up in a cult that convinced them murder was philosophy. Some have spoken publicly about their experiences. Others have disappeared into anonymity, too traumatized or too ashamed to face what they were part of. A few still believe, still think that Ziz was right, that the philosophy was sound, that the violence was justified. They're out there, somewhere, waiting for the next person who can give them permission to transcend morality. The case raised uncomfortable questions that the tech community still hasn't fully answered. About the relationship between intelligence and manipulation. About the dangers of closed ideological systems. About what happens when people who are very smart convince themselves that they're too smart to be wrong. And about the thin line between philosophy and cult behavior. Because the Zizians didn't start with violence, they started with ideas. With questions about consciousness and AI and how to think more clearly. With the same intellectual curiosity that drives genuine philosophical inquiry. But somewhere along the way, the questions became answers. The exploration became certainty. The philosophy became a weapon. Jack Lasota is currently serving a 40-year sentence in a California state prison. He still writes. Still publishes essays online through supporters who maintain his websites. Still argues that he was right, that hemispheric integration is real, that the violence was necessary, that history will vindicate him. It won't, but the ideas persist. Mutated, rebranded, stripped of the most obvious cult markers, but fundamentally the same. The belief that some people have access to truths others don't. That ordinary morality is a cage. That violence can be rational if you're rational enough. The Zizians are gone. But the impulse that created them, the desire to be special, to be right, to matter so much that the rules don't apply, that's still here. Still waiting for the next charismatic philosopher to give it shape. Still looking for people who are smart enough to be dangerous and desperate enough to believe. Emma Chun was 26 years old when she died. She had a degree in computer science from Stanford. She wanted to work on AI safety. She wanted to make the world better. She was smart, thoughtful, idealistic. Exactly the kind of person who should have been able to see through the manipulation. But intelligence isn't protection. Sometimes it's the vulnerability. Because the smartest people are often the ones most susceptible to the belief that they're too smart to be fooled, that they can handle extreme ideas, that they can engage with dangerous philosophy without being changed by it, that they're different. They're not. The storage unit where Emma died has been cleaned out now. The blood has been scrubbed away. The journals have been entered into evidence. The shrine has been dismantled. But somewhere in the Bay Area, in a coffee shop or a group house or an online forum, someone is reading about hemispheric consciousness, about transcending ordinary thinking, about the necessity of correction, and they're starting to believe. If you want more psychological true crime narrations that explore the darkest intersections of ideology and violence, subscribe for the next case.